Imagine your account in 11th century France. Someone calls you a knight. You don't thank them, you hit them. In the year 1000, calling a great lord a knight was a grave insult. Knights were low-status horseback soldiers, not prestigious nobles. But fast forward 3 centuries, and every duke, count, and king in Europe proudly styles himself a knight. That reversal reveals how Europe's ruling class worked. The answer involves a very specific way of holding a stick on a horse, a desperate church hauling bones through open fields, and one of history's most successful campaigns to turn brute force into hereditary privilege. To understand that reversal, we start with what made a medieval noble a noble, and it wasn't land, title, or education. It was a specific way of fighting. This is the crucial distinction because it sets medieval nobility apart from every other European aristocracy. Roman senators were literate civilians who governed through law and public rhetoric. Early modern aristocrats defined themselves through court culture, patronage, and refined manners. Medieval nobles defined themselves through mounted combat. Most couldn't read. They didn't govern in any administrative sense. They trained for war, equipped themselves for war, and measured all status by performance in war, specifically war fought on horseback. They weren't rich landowners who happened to fight. The fighting method was the identity. Strip it away, and they had no claim to special status. Everything else, the titles, the lands, the legal privileges that would accumulate over centuries, all grew from this single root. The technique was called the couched lance charge. The rider tucked a long, heavy lance under his arm, braced it against his torso, point aimed forward, and charged at full gallop. The impact delivered the combined momentum of rider, armor, and horse through a single point. Devastating. The two technologies made it possible. First, the stirrup. Without stirrups, a rider gripping a weapon had no reliable way to stay balanced. Stirrups anchored the feet and freed the hands. Second, the high-backed saddle. When the lance struck a target at speed, the shock traveled backwards through the rider's body. A flat saddle would launch him off the horse. The high back rose behind the rider's torso and absorbed that rearward force. Both technologies existed long before the technique became standard. Warriors were conservative, and they clung to older methods of swinging, hurling, or jabbing the lance well into the 1100s. The couched lance charge wasn't universal until around 1100. This shared fighting method held together a class with enormous internal differences. By 1300, the hierarchy had clear tiers. At the bottom, knights. Some held land, many didn't. Landless knights lived in a lord's household, eating at his table, fighting his wars, professional soldiers without estates of their own. Around the year 1000, this was a low-status position. Calling a count a knight, as we saw, was an insult. It implied he was nothing more than a household soldier. The prestige of knighthood was a later invention. Above knights, castellans, nobles who possessed one or more castles, giving them a fixed territorial base. Then the upper nobility, barons, counts, marcher lords who defended dangerous frontier territories, dukes, and at the apex, kings. Right? The gap between a landless knight sleeping in a baron's hall and a king commanding armies was immense. Yet they all trained in the same mounted combat technique and recognized each other across those vast differences as members of a single class. But this hierarchy came under pressure from outside, and the nobility's response reshaped European society for centuries. The trigger was economic. The commercial revolution of the High Middle Ages, accelerating through the 1100s and 1200s, created wealthy merchants whose fortunes rivaled those of lesser nobles. Many of these merchants aspired to noble status, and they had the money to buy land, build manor houses, and imitate aristocratic life. The nobility's response was defensive, make status hereditary. Around the year 1000, nobility was vague. No specific legal definition existed. If the community recognized you as noble, you were noble. Right? By 1300, the rules had changed. You needed to prove noble ancestry, parents, grandparents, sometimes 4 or more generations back. Entry into the class narrowed dramatically. The tools for proving noble descent emerged in this period. Patronymics, family names, surnames, became essential. The earliest noble surnames came from castles. A family adopted the name of its most important fortification. That detail is revealing. Nobles identified themselves not by profession or trade, but by a military structure. Coats of arms appeared. Heraldic symbols passed from father to son, displayed on shields, banners, and seals. Genealogies became obsessions. Families commissioned elaborate records tracing their lineage as far back as possible, and sometimes forged documents to fill the gaps. The system was never perfectly sealed. Wealthy outsiders occasionally purchased exemptions. But the direction was clear. From roughly open entry around 1000 to a dramatically more closed hereditary system by 1300. Closing the ranks was one thing. The real prize was the set of concrete legal privileges that came with noble status by 1300. Around the year 1000, being called noble carried no specific legal weight. It was reputation, public opinion, nothing more. By 1300, nobility men fiercely defended legal rights. The most consequential was tax exemption. Nobles argued that their military service, riding to war at their own expense, risking death in combat, already fulfilled their obligation to the realm. Paying taxes on top of that, they insisted, was redundant. This claim was contested by kings and commoners alike, but it was frequently honored, right? And it would remain politically explosive for centuries. Noble tax exemption was still a central grievance fueling the French Revolution nearly 500 years later. Two more privileges mattered deeply: the right to honorable execution. If a noble was condemned to death, he claimed the right to die by beheading, swift and dignified. The alternatives were grim. Burning was agonizing, hanging was slow, humiliating, and the corpse was left on public display as a warning. Nobles genuinely valued this distinction, a marker of status even in death. The third privilege was the claimed exclusive right to vengeance, violent retaliation against anyone who wronged a noble or his family, extending to the offender's king. This one was never fully secured. Personal vengeance was too deeply embedded across all social classes. Peasants and the townspeople pursued it too. The nobility could never successfully restrict it to themselves. These privileges didn't exist in a vacuum. They rested on something concrete: the ability to do violence and to profit from it. Noble violence was not random destruction. It was a business model with two channels. The first was warfare itself. Looting rival nobles was standard practice. Even better targets, wealthy monasteries and churches packed with treasure but lacking military defenses. A single successful raid might yield gold liturgical vessels, silver, stored grain, and livestock. For many lesser nobles, especially landless knights, plunder was a primary income source. But warfare was unpredictable and dangerous. The more reliable way to convert military power into steady revenue was lordship, and lordship was not vague authority. It was a bundle of three specific profitable powers. First, the right to collect payments in cash or kind, a percentage of a peasant's harvest, fees for using the lord's mill or oven, tolls on roads through his territory. The justification was protection, though the peasants had no say in the arrangement. Second, the right of justice. The lord held court, tried accused criminals, and collected fines from those convicted. The lord served as judge. You can imagine how those trials went. Convictions were virtually guaranteed, and every conviction meant revenue. Third, the right to demand unpaid labor on the lord's own land. Peasants owed days of work each year, plowing, harvesting, building, without compensation. Together, These three powers made lordship a comprehensive extraction system backed by the military force concentrated in the lord's castle. One variable determined how harsh lordship became: the density of private castles. A castle was the enforcement tool, the base from which a lord projected power and punished resistance. Where castles proliferated unchecked, lordship was most oppressive. The worst conditions around 1000 appeared in the western lands of the former Carolingian Empire, France, northeastern Spain, northern Italy. The Carolingian state had collapsed in the 9th and the 10th centuries, and the local strongmen built castles in the vacuum with no one to restrain them. Germany, with stronger royal authority, kept castle construction more controlled. England, never part of the Carolingian world, maintained the tightest grip on who could build fortifications. But these contrasts weren't permanent. When royal authority weakened in Germany or England, castle building and harsh lordship followed. The pattern held everywhere. Weaker central authority meant more private castles, and more castles meant harsher lordship. By the year 1000, the people theoretically responsible for controlling noble violence, kings, counts, dukes, had clearly failed. The church's own properties were among the prime targets of noble raiding, so the clergy stepped in. The first initiative was the Peace of God, proclaimed at the Council of Charroux in 989 in southern France. It identified categories of defenseless people whom nobles were forbidden to harm: clergy, orphans, widows, virgins, peasants, even farm animals. The prohibitions were remarkably specific: no robbing churches, no stealing livestock, no beating peasants, no burning homes, no seizing grain, no cutting down fruit trees. Each prohibition was drawn from observed reality. The church was cataloging, item by item, exactly what armed nobles were doing to the vulnerable populations around them. The second initiative was the Truce of God, first proclaimed at the Council of Toulouse in 1027, where the peace of God protected categories of people. The truce designated specific times when all noble fighting was forbidden. Initially, the protected periods were limited, Lent through Easter and Sundays, but the movement expanded rapidly. By 1100, the forbidden period covered Thursday evenings through Monday morning, essentially the full weekend, plus the entire Christmas season. The ambition was remarkable. Eventually, the truce attempted to ban noble violence for more days of the year than it permitted. Both the peace and the truce relied on the same extraordinary enforcement mechanism, unlike anything secular rulers had attempted. Clergy convened open-air councils and summoned nobles from across the region. At the council site, they gathered saints' relics, fragments of bone, vials of blood, pieces of clothing from holy figures, and piled them in public view. The atmosphere was deliberately theatrical: sacred objects radiating supernatural authority, crowds of common people watching, and the implicit threat that any noble who defied the assembly faced not human punishment but divine wrath channeled through the relics. Under this pressure, nobles were urged to swear solemn oaths for swearing violence against the protected people and during the protected times. It was creative, it was desperate, and it was the church stepping into a role that secular authority had abandoned. Creative, but insufficient. The process broke down at every stage. Nobles could ignore the summons entirely. They could attend but refuse to swear. They could swear the oath and then, once back in their distant castles among armed companions, break it without consequence. The most revealing evidence of the movement's limits, it had to be renewed decade after decade. Councils were convened again and again across the 11th and the 12th centuries, repeating the same prohibitions, extracting the same oaths. That frequency of renewal is itself the proof. Neither sacred relics nor fear of damnation could reliably override the economic and social incentives that made noble violence profitable. Pull back to the bigger picture, this was a society where violence was not a flaw in the system, it was the system. Every privilege, every revenue stream, every marker of noble status traced back to the capacity for mounted combat. The transformation from 1000 to 1300 was a project of converting raw military power into hereditary legal privilege, making temporary dominance permanent. And it succeeded. Noble tax exemption, honorable execution rights, and hereditary status persisted for centuries after the nobility had abandoned its original military function. The privileges outlived their justification by hundreds of years, and because neither secular authority nor the church could fully contain noble violence, later centuries produced one more creative response, the cultural idea of chivalry, which tried to redirect and channel what could not be suppressed,